Hey guys, tonight we're exploring the nature of power and what happens when the very institutions designed to protect society become the source of its terror. We place our trust in the law, in the uniformed officers and the quiet authority of the justice system. We believe it operates on a foundation of evidence, due process, and a clear line between right and wrong. But this is a story about a time and a place where that line was not just blurred, but systematically erased. It's a story about a shadow organization that allegedly operated within a national police force, a group of men who believed that the only way to fight a dirty war was with dirty hands. We are journeying to a nation grappling with political turmoil, a place where the fear of terrorism created an atmosphere where the ends were used to justify the means. It's a case that isn't about a single killer, but about a system of alleged coercion and brutality, where the goal was not to find the truth, but to secure a confession at any cost. It's a story that asks a chilling question. Who polices the police when they become the monsters? Before you get comfortable, maybe take a moment to think about the immense power that we, as a society, grant to law enforcement. We give them the power to detain, to question, and to use force, all with the trust that this power will be wielded with integrity. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're ready to look into the darkness that can fester when that trust is broken. And as always, please let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. Seeing our community of late-night historians gathered from around the world is a powerful reminder of our shared quest for understanding. Now let the room grow quiet. Let's journey into the controversial and shadowed history of the Garda Heavy Gang. The Garda Heavy Gang Ireland in the 1970s was a nation grappling with immense political and social turmoil. The troubles in Northern Ireland were raging, a brutal and complex conflict that constantly threatened to spill over the border into the Republic of Ireland. There was a pervasive fear of paramilitary activity from both Republican and Loyalist groups, and the Irish government felt it was a nation under siege. In response to this threat, they passed a series of emergency anti-terrorism laws that gave the National Police Force, the Garda Síochána, sweeping new powers of arrest, detention, and interrogation. It was in this atmosphere of national crisis and heightened state power that a special, unofficial unit was allegedly formed within the Gardaí. They were not a formal task force with a public name, but a loosely knit group of tough, seasoned detectives, handpicked from the Dublin-based crime and security squads. Their mission was clear: to crack down on subversive organizations, solve high-profile, politically sensitive crimes, and get results, using any means necessary. They quickly gained a reputation in the criminal underworld and, eventually, in the press, for their brutal and terrifyingly effective interrogation techniques. They became known, in whispers and then in headlines, as the Heavy Gang. The story of the Heavy Gang's most infamous and consequential cases begins in the mid-1970s, a period marked by a series of violent crimes that were believed to have paramilitary connections. One such crime was the Salins mail train robbery of March 31, 1976. A passenger train traveling from Cork to Dublin was stopped, and a gang of masked men made off with over £200,000, a massive haul at the time. The robbery was executed with a military-style precision that immediately led the Gardaí to suspect the involvement of a Republican paramilitary group. The investigation led them to the Irish Republican Socialist Party, IRSP, a small, radical political party with a militant wing, the Irish National Liberation Army, INLA. The Gardaí arrested several members of the IRSP, including Oscar Bretnack, Nicky Kelly, and Brian McNally. The men were taken to various Garda stations for questioning. What allegedly happened next would become the foundation of one of the biggest scandals in the history of the Irish state. Over the next several days, the men were held incommunicado. They would later claim, with harrowing consistency, that they were subjected to a systematic and brutal campaign of torture at the hands of a team of Dublin-based detectives. They alleged they were relentlessly beaten with fists, rubber hoses, and heavy books, often on the soles of their feet and the backs of their hands to minimize visible bruising. They claimed they were deprived of sleep for days on end, subjected to constant, screaming verbal abuse, and that some were partially suffocated with wet towels and plastic bags. The goal of this alleged torture was singular: to extract a confession. The detectives, they claimed, had already written out detailed statements implicating them in the train robbery. And the beatings would only stop when they agreed to sign them. After days of this alleged ordeal, their wills were broken. Bretnack, Kelly, and McNally all signed detailed confessions. A fourth man, John Fitzpatrick, also signed a statement implicating the others. These signed confessions became the sole basis of the state's case against them. There was no other significant physical evidence linking any of the men to the robbery. When the case went to trial, the men, who became known as the Salins Four, immediately recanted their confessions, detailing their allegations of torture to the court. Their lawyers presented medical evidence of their injuries. But the trial took place in the Special Criminal Court, a juryless court designed for terrorism cases. The judges chose to believe the testimony of the Garda detectives, who flatly denied all allegations of abuse, claiming the men's injuries were self-inflicted in a coordinated attempt to discredit the police. 3 of the 4 men, Bretnack, Kelly, and McNally, were convicted based entirely on their contested confessions and were sentenced to long prison terms. The Salins case became a cause célèbre, a rallying cry for human rights organizations like Amnesty International, who condemned the convictions as a gross miscarriage of justice. It was seen as the most egregious example of the heavy gang's methods, but it was far from the only one. Another case that would become inextricably linked with the heavy gang was the murder of a prominent farmer named Martin "Sonny" Hines in County Galway in 1976. The investigation led the Gardaí to a local man who they believed held a grudge against Hines. This man and several of his family members were arrested. They, too, would later allege that they were subjected to days of brutal beatings and intimidation by a team of visiting Dublin detectives until some of them signed incriminating statements. While the case against them eventually collapsed due to a lack of evidence, the allegations of police brutality followed the same disturbing pattern. The alleged members of the heavy gang itself were a shadowy group. Their existence was never officially acknowledged, but a handful of names of high-ranking detectives from Dublin's specialist units appeared again and again in the allegations of brutality across the country. These were men who were seen by their superiors as good-getters, tough, old-school cops who could close a difficult case. In the high-pressure environment of the time, their methods were often overlooked or tacitly approved of. They were the state's blunt instrument in a dirty war. The controversy surrounding these cases created a deep and lasting wound in Irish society. It shattered the public's trust in the Garda Síochána, an institution that had, until then, been one of the most respected in the nation. It raised profound and uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice in a state under threat. At what point do the methods used to protect a society from terrorism become a form of state-sponsored terror themselves? The story of the heavy gang is not just a story about a few bad apples. It is a story about a systemic problem, a culture of impunity that was allowed to fester within the police force during a time of national crisis. The confessions they extracted may have closed case files and put men behind bars, but the brutal methods they allegedly used would cast a long, dark shadow over the Irish justice system, a shadow that would lead to decades of appeals, public inquiries, and a painful, ongoing search for the truth. The convictions in the Salins train robbery case, based entirely on confessions allegedly extracted through torture, marked a watershed moment. While the state had secured its victory in court, the persistent and detailed allegations of brutality refused to go away. The case became a festering wound in the Irish public consciousness, a symbol of a justice system that seemed willing to sacrifice its own principles in the name of expediency. The men who were imprisoned, particularly Nicky Kelly and Oscar Bretnack, became unwilling figureheads for a growing movement demanding accountability and a re-examination of the methods used by the Gardaí's elite squads. From their prison cells, the convicted men continued to fight. They launched appeal after appeal, their legal battles slowly working their way through the Irish court system. Their cause was taken up by a dedicated group of lawyers, human rights activists, and journalists who were determined to expose what they believed was a state-sanctioned system of abuse. The Salins case became synonymous with the heavy gang, and the two narratives became inextricably linked. The evidence presented in these appeals was often harrowing. Medical reports from the time of the men's arrests were re-examined, showing clear evidence of bruising, cuts, and other injuries consistent with their claims of being beaten. Former prisoners came forward with stories of hearing screams and cries for help coming from the interrogation rooms. The defense teams argued that the confessions were not just coerced, but were factually impossible, containing details that contradicted the known evidence of the train robbery itself. They contended that the statements were not the words of the accused, but were a script written by the detectives, a script that the men were forced to sign under extreme duress. The Gardaí and the state, however, held firm. They continued to publicly deny the existence of any heavy gang and maintained that the allegations of torture were a coordinated and malicious smear campaign orchestrated by subversive elements to undermine the authority of the police and the courts. The detectives involved in the interrogations presented a united front, consistently denying any wrongdoing under oath. It was a case of one group's word against another's, the word of convicted terrorists against the word of decorated police officers. For years, the system chose to believe the police, but the campaign for justice was relentless. In 1980, one of the convicted men, Nikki Kelly, who had been on the run after escaping custody, was dramatically rearrested. His case, however, had gained significant international attention. Amnesty International declared him a prisoner of conscience. Famous musicians and artists, including Christy Moore and U2, wrote songs about the case and played at benefit concerts, bringing the story to a massive new audience. The political pressure was mounting. The first major crack in the state's official narrative came not from a courtroom, but from a change in the political climate. The troubles were evolving, and the intense, crisis-level atmosphere of the mid-1970s had begun to ease slightly. With this came a greater willingness to look back and re-examine the more extreme measures that had been taken. In 1984, after serving several years in prison, Nikki Kelly was finally released on humanitarian grounds by the Minister for Justice. It was not a full pardon, but it was a tacit admission that a grave injustice had likely occurred. The final, definitive vindication came years later. In 1992, after a long and exhaustive legal battle, the Irish Court of Criminal Appeal quashed Nikki Kelly's conviction entirely. The following year, Oscar Bretnack and Brian McNally also had their convictions overturned. The court did not explicitly rule that the men had been tortured, but it found that their confessions were inadmissible, concluding that there was a credible possibility that their accounts of oppression and coercion were true. After 17 years, the Salins Three were finally, officially exonerated. They received a state apology and substantial financial compensation. The quashing of the Salins convictions was a monumental event. It was a public and legal acknowledgement that the system had failed catastrophically. The case led to significant reforms within the Garda Síochána, including the introduction of new rules for the interrogation of suspects, such as the electronic recording of interviews and improved access to legal counsel. The era of the heavy gang and its brutal backroom interrogation methods was, at least officially, over. However, the story does not end with the exoneration of the Salins men. The legacy of the heavy gang extends to numerous other cases from that era, many of which have never been fully re-examined. The case of the Kerry babies in 1984 is another notorious example. A young woman named Joanne Hayes was arrested in connection with the discovery of a baby's body on a beach in County Kerry. She and her family were subjected to days of intense, psychologically grueling interrogations by members of the same group of Dublin detectives. The Hayes family, confused, exhausted, and deeply traumatized, ended up signing a series of bizarre and contradictory confessions, admitting to a murder that forensic evidence would later prove they could not possibly have committed. The case against them collapsed, but the public inquiry that followed, known as the Kerry Babies Tribunal, exposed the coercive and manipulative interrogation techniques that were still being employed by some members of the force. The men who were alleged to be the core members of the heavy gang were never prosecuted for their actions. Many of them retired with full honors and pensions, continuing to deny any wrongdoing to their graves. For them, they were simply tough cops doing a tough job in a difficult time. They saw themselves as the thin blue line that had held the country together during a period of national crisis. But for their alleged victims, the story is very different. They were the men and women who were caught in the gears of the state's security apparatus. Their lives were shattered, not just by the prison sentences they served, but by the psychological trauma of their experiences. They were left with a profound sense of betrayal by a justice system that was supposed to protect them. The legacy of the Garda Heavy Gang is a complex and deeply uncomfortable chapter in Irish history. It is a story about how fear, the fear of terrorism, the fear of subversion, can lead a democratic state to adopt the very tactics of oppression that it claims to be fighting against. It highlights the profound danger of a police culture that prioritizes confessions over evidence and results over due process. The era of the Heavy Gang is now a part of history, but the questions it raised about the nature of power, justice, and the integrity of law enforcement continue to resonate. The shadows of those backroom interrogation cells still linger, a powerful and cautionary tale about what can happen when the guardians of the law believe they are above it. The fight for justice for the victims of that era did not end with the quashing of the Salins convictions. It simply entered a new phase, a long, slow battle for historical truth and a full accounting of a time when the pursuit of order came at the cost of justice itself. The official exoneration of the men involved in the Salins train robbery case was a landmark victory, but it did not close the book on the era of the Heavy Gang. Instead, it opened a new chapter, one focused on legacy, accountability, and the long, slow process of historical reckoning. The quashed convictions were a public admission of a systemic failure, but the question of individual accountability for the alleged acts of torture and coercion remained largely unaddressed. The detectives who were repeatedly named in the allegations were, for the most part, shielded from any legal consequences. The Irish government, while issuing apologies and paying compensation, has never officially acknowledged the existence of a formal unit called the Heavy Gang. The official stance has always been that any instances of abuse were the actions of a few individual officers who may have overstepped their bounds during a time of national crisis, not the work of a sanctioned, organized squad. This position has been a source of deep and ongoing frustration for the victims and their advocates, who see it as a refusal by the state to fully confront the darkness of its own past. They argue that the pattern of abuse across multiple high-profile cases, involving the same group of detectives, points to something far more organized than a few isolated incidents. In the years since the major court victories of the 1990s, the focus has shifted to the long-term impact of these cases. The men who were wrongfully convicted, like Oscar Bretnack and Nikki Kelly, have spent their adult lives grappling with the aftermath. They lost years of their lives to prison, their reputations were destroyed, and they have had to live with the profound psychological trauma of their experiences. They have become powerful public speakers and activists, using their own stories to campaign for police reform and to support other potential victims of miscarriages of justice. Their fight is no longer just for their own names, but for the principle of a more transparent and accountable justice system. The story of the Heavy Gang has also had a lasting and transformative effect on the Garda Síochána itself. The scandals of the 1970s and 80s forced the organization to undergo a period of significant reform. The introduction of the electronic recording of interrogations was a direct response to the allegations of verbals, the practice of detectives fabricating confessions. New, stricter rules regarding a suspect's access to legal counsel during questioning were also implemented. The Gardaí established a new internal complaints tribunal to investigate allegations of misconduct. While these reforms have not eliminated all problems within the force, they represent a fundamental shift away from the unchecked power that was wielded during the Heavy Gang era. The modern Garda Síochána is, in many ways, an institution that was reshaped by the very abuses it once tried to deny. The cultural impact of the Heavy Gang story has also been profound. It has been the subject of numerous books, television documentaries, and plays. It has become a cornerstone of the modern Irish narrative about the Troubles era, a complex and often uncomfortable look at the moral compromises that were made in the name of state security. The story challenges the simple, heroic narrative of the state fighting terrorism and introduces a darker, more morally ambiguous shade of gray. It forces a conversation about the nature of power and the ease with which a society, in the grip of fear, can begin to sacrifice its own democratic ideals. For the individual detectives who were alleged to be members of the Heavy Gang, their legacies are complicated. To their supporters and many of their colleagues, they remain heroes, the untouchables of their day who took on the paramilitaries and won, keeping the Republic safe from the chaos that was consuming the North. They see the allegations against them as the bitter complaints of convicted terrorists and the work of a naive media that didn't understand the realities of fighting a dirty war. But to their detractors, they are symbols of a dark and shameful period. Men who abused their power and corrupted the very essence of the law they were sworn to uphold. They are seen as bullies who preyed on the vulnerable to secure convictions, regardless of actual guilt. The truth of their motives and actions likely lies somewhere in the complex space between these two narratives. Today, the era of the heavy gang is officially over. The political and social climate that allowed such a unit to operate has changed dramatically. But the questions raised by their actions continue to resonate. The cases they were involved in are still being debated and re-examined by historians and legal scholars. The search for justice for other potential victims continues. The story of the Garda Heavy Gang is a powerful and cautionary tale that is relevant far beyond the borders of Ireland. It is a story about the universal tension between security and liberty. It shows how easily a nation, when faced with a genuine threat, can be tempted to abandon its own principles. It is a reminder that the true test of a democracy is not how it treats its most powerful citizens, but how it treats its most vulnerable, especially those it deems to be its enemies. The confessions signed under duress in those backroom interrogation cells have faded, and the men who extracted them are gone. But the echo of their actions remains, a permanent warning about the dark path that opens up when the pursuit of justice is replaced by the simple, brutal demand for a confession. The Atlas Vampire Murders. The dark saga of the Garda Heavy Gang is a story about the abuse of power, a systemic corruption that played out over years in interrogation rooms. But some stories of terror are not so widespread. They are intensely focused, a singular, horrific event that seems to erupt from the darkest corners of folklore and superstition. This is a story that takes place in the heart of a modern, sophisticated European city, but it feels like a tale from a much older, darker time. It's a story about a crime so bizarre and so steeped in the macabre that it earned its unknown killer a terrifying and legendary name. This is the case of the Atlas Vampire. Stockholm, Sweden, in the early 1930s, was a city of elegant architecture, intellectual vigor, and progressive social ideals. It was seen as a beacon of modern, rational European society. But on the afternoon of March 4, 1932, a discovery was made in the city's central Atlas neighborhood that would reveal a horror that seemed to belong to the world of Gothic nightmares, not the clean, orderly streets of Stockholm. The victim was a 32-year-old woman named Lily Lindström. Lily was known in the neighborhood as a call girl, a woman who entertained male clients in her small, ground-floor apartment at number 8 Sankta Riksplan. She had been divorced for several years and was raising her young daughter, but she was also a part of the city's hidden, shadowy demimonde. Her life was a precarious one, lived on the fringes of respectable society. On that Friday afternoon, Lily's close friend and neighbor, a woman named Minnie, became concerned. Lily had a habit of calling Minnie every morning, but for the past 2 days, the phone had been silent. Minnie went to Lily's apartment and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Worried, she contacted the police. The police arrived and forced their way into the small apartment. The scene that greeted them was one of almost unbelievable, ritualistic horror. The apartment was neat and tidy. There were no signs of a struggle, but on the bed, lying face down, was the body of Lily Lindström. She was naked, and her clothes were neatly folded on a chair nearby, as if she had undressed herself. The cause of death was immediately apparent. She had been killed by a series of powerful, crushing blows to her head, likely with a heavy, blunt object. But it was the other details of the scene that pushed the crime into the realm of the truly bizarre and terrifying. The police found a blood-stained gravy ladle near the bed, and when the medical examiner turned Lily's body over, they discovered the source of the killer's monstrous nickname. Her body had been drained of a significant amount of its blood. The investigators came to a horrifying conclusion. The killer had used the ladle to drink his victim's blood directly from her wounds. It was an act of vampirism, a detail so shocking and so archaic that it seemed impossible in a modern city. The press, when they learned of this detail, immediately christened the unknown killer the Atlas Vampire, a name that perfectly captured the gruesome, folkloric horror of the crime. The story became a sensation, terrifying the city of Stockholm and captivating the rest of Europe. The investigation into the murder was intense. The police were hunting for a killer who was not just violent, but who seemed to be driven by a dark and powerful psychological compulsion. They began the painstaking process of trying to reconstruct Lily Lindstrom's final hours. They learned that on the night of her murder, a Tuesday, she had been with friends. Later that evening, she had taken a client back to her apartment. This client was their primary suspect. The police interviewed Lily's friends, asking if she had mentioned the name of the man she was meeting. They had no name, but they did have a description. Her friends said that Lily had received a phone call earlier that evening from a man with a foreign accent who wanted to arrange a meeting. The last person to see Lily alive, other than her killer, was her friend Minnie. Minnie had been in Lily's apartment until around 7 p.m. that night. She said that just before she left, the phone rang. Lily answered it, and Minnie overheard her arranging to meet a man later that evening. She heard Lily give the man her address. This confirmed that the killer was likely the man who had called, the man with the foreign accent. The police then focused on the physical evidence, or lack thereof. The killer had been remarkably careful. Despite the horrific nature of the crime, he had left behind no fingerprints. He had wiped the apartment clean. The only potential clue was a used contraceptive that was found inside Lily's body, suggesting the killer had engaged in sexual activity with her, but had been careful to ensure he left no biological trace, a remarkably prescient act for a time before DNA analysis. The investigation branched out, looking into the shadowy world of Lily's clients. She kept a little black book with the names and numbers of the men she entertained. The police began the long and delicate process of tracking down and interviewing these men. Many of them were prominent, respectable members of Stockholm society. Businessmen, politicians, and professionals. They were all questioned, but one by one, they were cleared. They all had alibis, and none of them fit the description of the man Lily's friends had described. The case was a frustrating series of dead ends. The killer was a ghost. He had a vague description. A man with a foreign accent, but no name and no face. He had committed a crime of shocking brutality and then had simply vanished back into the fabric of the city. The motive seemed to be a dark, psychological one, a combination of violent rage and a vampiric, ritualistic compulsion. The police were not just hunting a murderer. They were hunting a monster, a creature who seemed to have stepped out of the darkest pages of a Bram Stoker novel and onto the modern streets of Stockholm. The public was in a state of panic. The idea of a real-life vampire stalking the city was a terrifying one. The police were inundated with tips and theories. They investigated every lead, no matter how strange. But the trail grew colder with each passing day. The Atlas vampire had committed a perfect, horrifying crime and had left behind nothing but a scene of unforgettable macabre and a city gripped by a primal, ancient fear. The hunt for the man who drank blood would become one of Sweden's most infamous and enduring unsolved mysteries. The investigation into the murder of Lily Lindstrom was one of the most intense and high-profile in Swedish history. The nature of the crime, the brutal bludgeoning combined with the horrifying ritualistic act of vampirism, was so far outside the realm of a normal homicide that it created a unique and profound sense of terror. The Stockholm police, under immense pressure to catch the Atlas vampire, dedicated enormous resources to the case, but they were stymied at every turn by a killer who had been both forensically aware and maddeningly elusive. With the investigation into Lily's known clientele yielding no viable suspects, the police widened their net, focusing on the few concrete clues they possessed. The first was the description of the killer as a man with a foreign accent who had spoken to Lily on the phone. This was a vague but crucial piece of information. In the relatively homogeneous Stockholm of the 1930s, a foreign accent would have been more noticeable. Detectives began to canvass the neighborhood, asking about any foreign men who had recently been seen in the area. They questioned hotel clerks, shopkeepers, and landlords, but no one could provide a name or a solid lead. The foreigner theory was difficult to pursue without more specific information about his nationality or appearance. The second major clue was the murder weapon, or rather, the lack thereof. The coroner had determined that Lily was killed by powerful blows from a heavy, blunt object. The police searched the apartment and the surrounding area meticulously, but the weapon was never found. This suggested that the killer had brought the weapon with him and had taken it when he left, another sign of a premeditated and controlled crime. The blood-stained gravy ladle found at the scene was tested, but it contained only Lily's blood, offering no clues to the identity of her killer. It remained a horrifying and macabre artifact, a symbol of the killer's ghoulish ritual. The police investigation began to explore more psychological avenues. They consulted with some of the earliest criminal profilers, trying to build a picture of the man they were hunting. They concluded they were looking for an individual with a severe and violent psychopathology. The combination of the brutal, head-focused violence and the act of drinking the victim's blood suggested a killer with a deep-seated rage, likely directed at women, combined with a powerful, ritualistic, and possibly sexual fantasy. This was not a simple crime of passion. It was the work of a highly organized, ritualistic, and predatory killer. The investigation took a significant, though ultimately frustrating, turn when the police focused their attention on the local police force itself. An officer in the Atlas neighborhood, a man known for his strange and sometimes violent behavior, came under suspicion. According to some reports, this officer was known to be one of Lily Lindstrom's clients. The theory was a shocking one, that a police officer had used his knowledge of investigative techniques to commit a perfect, untraceable murder. He would have known how to avoid leaving fingerprints, how to clean a crime scene, and how to deflect suspicion. This theory was pursued internally, but like all the others, it could not be substantiated. The officer in question had an alibi, and there was no direct evidence to link him to the crime. As the official investigation stalled, the case of the Atlas vampire became a fixture of public fascination and fear. The newspapers were filled with sensationalist stories and lurid speculation. The case tapped into a deep, primal fear, the ancient folklore of the vampire brought to life in a modern, rational city. The public, in the absence of a real suspect, began to create their own. Rumors and accusations flew, and the atmosphere in Stockholm was one of paranoia. One of the most persistent theories to emerge from the public was that the killer was a medical student or a doctor. This theory was based on the seemingly clinical nature of the crime. The draining of the blood and the careful, clean state of the apartment suggested to some a person with anatomical knowledge and a detached, surgical mindset. Investigators did question students and staff at the nearby Karolinska Institute, a major medical university, but this line of inquiry also failed to produce a viable suspect. Years passed and the case grew colder. The trail of the Atlas vampire had gone completely dark. He had struck once with terrifying brutality, and had then vanished as if he were a true creature of the night. The case was never officially closed, but it became one of Sweden's most infamous and enduring unsolved mysteries. Decades later, in the modern era of true crime investigation and online forums, the case has been re-examined by a new generation of sleuths. These modern investigators have brought new perspectives to the scant evidence. Some have focused on the possibility that the vampirism was not a literal act of drinking blood, but was part of a more complex occult or satanic ritual. They point to other details of the scene, the neatness, the folded clothes, as potential evidence of a ritualistic staging. This theory suggests the killer was not just a sadist, but a believer in a dark, magical system. Others have proposed a more mundane, but no less tragic explanation. They suggest that the blood drinking was a red herring, a deliberate act of misdirection by a cunning killer. The true motive, they argue, may have been a simple robbery that went wrong, or a personal dispute with Lily. The killer, in an attempt to confuse the police and throw them off his trail, staged the scene to look like the work of a deranged, supernatural monster. By creating the persona of the Atlas vampire, he successfully diverted attention from a more conventional and traceable motive. This theory paints a picture of a killer who was not just brutal, but also highly intelligent and manipulative. One of the most compelling modern theories attempts to link the Atlas vampire murder to a broader pattern of crime. Some researchers have suggested that the killer could have been an itinerant criminal, a man who moved from city to city, preying on vulnerable women. They have looked for similar, unsolved murders in other European cities from the same time period, searching for a shared signature. However, the unique, vampiric element of the Lindstrom murder makes it a difficult case to link to any others. It remains a singular, horrifying anomaly. The case has also been re-examined through the lens of modern psychological profiling. Experts now believe the killer was likely an organized offender. He was intelligent, planned his crime in advance, brought a weapon with him, and took steps to clean up the crime scene. He was likely socially competent, able to charm Lily on the phone and gain her trust enough to be invited into her home. He was a predator who wore a mask of normalcy, a man who could move through society undetected. This profile fits with the idea of a professional like a doctor or even the police officer suspect, but it is too broad to identify a specific individual. The mystery of the Atlas vampire endures because it is a crime that seems to defy all rational explanation. It is a story that forces us to confront the reality that sometimes human behavior can be so dark and so bizarre that it pushes the boundaries of our understanding. The killer was not just a murderer, he was a creator of nightmares. He didn't just take a life. He created a legend, a terrifying real-life monster that has haunted the city of Stockholm for nearly a century. The neat little apartment on Sankta Riksplan became the stage for a crime that felt ancient and primal, a dark ritual of blood and violence. The man who committed this act remains a ghost, his identity and his twisted motives lost to the past, leaving behind only the chilling and unforgettable legacy of his name. The Atlas Vampire. The unsolved case of the Atlas Vampire has left a permanent, dark imprint on the cultural memory of Sweden. For over 90 years, the story has been a source of morbid fascination, a national boogeyman tale that serves as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most civilized and rational society. The failure of the police to ever identify a suspect has allowed the case to ascend into the realm of modern myth, a story where the lines between fact, folklore, and forensic science are hopelessly blurred. In the decades since the murder of Lily Lindstrom, the case has been periodically revisited by law enforcement, journalists, and historians, each hoping that a new perspective or a forgotten piece of information might finally shed light on the killer's identity. But the trail has remained stubbornly cold, the phantom as elusive today as he was in 1932. The initial mishandling of the crime scene, a common issue in the pre-forensic era, meant that any potential trace evidence was likely lost forever. The killer's careful cleanup and the lack of a clear motive have created a near-perfect vacuum of information. The legacy of the case is now primarily a cultural one. It has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and podcasts in Sweden and across Europe. Each new telling of the story re-examines the same scant clues, turning them over and over, searching for a new interpretation. The figure of the Atlas Vampire has become a stock character in Scandinavian noir, a symbol of a hidden, ritualistic evil that exists just beyond the perception of a mundane world. The various theories about the killer's identity continue to be debated with a passion that has not faded with time. The police officer theory, while never substantiated, remains a compelling and disturbing possibility for many. It speaks to a deep-seated fear of corrupt, institutional power and the terrifying idea that the person tasked with solving the crime could be the one who committed it. It would explain the killer's confidence, his forensic awareness, and his ability to vanish without a trace. The medical professional theory also endures. The seemingly clinical nature of the crime, the neatness, the draining of the blood, continues to suggest to some a mind that was familiar with anatomy and surgical procedures. In this narrative, the killer was a man of science who was also a monster, a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde figure living a double life in the heart of Stockholm. But it is the supernatural and occult theories that have given the case its lasting mythic quality. The act of vampirism, whether real or staged, taps into some of our oldest and most primal fears. It elevates the killer from a mere mortal into something more, a creature of the night. This element has ensured that the case will never be just another unsolved murder. It is a modern folktale, a story that blurs the line between a criminal investigation and a horror story. The victim, Lily Lindstrom, has often been overshadowed by the sensationalist identity of her killer. She is frequently remembered simply as the vampire's victim. But in recent years, there has been a renewed effort by some historians and writers to focus on her life, to see her not just as a statistic in a famous crime, but as a real person. She was a single mother struggling to survive in a difficult time, a woman living a precarious existence on the fringes of society. It was this very vulnerability that made her a target. Her story is a tragic reminder of the dangers faced by sex workers, whose lives are often devalued and whose murders are often given less investigative priority. The case of the Atlas vampire serves as a powerful example of how a single, bizarre detail can define a crime forever. Had the killer simply bludgeoned Lily Lindstrom to death, the case would have been a tragic but likely forgotten local murder. But the addition of the gravy ladle and the draining of the blood transformed it. It gave the killer a name, a persona, and a legend. It was an act of branding, whether intentional or not, that ensured his crime would achieve a kind of dark immortality. Today, the apartment building at 8 Sankta Riksplan still stands in the Atlas neighborhood of Stockholm. It is just another elegant, old building on a busy city street. But for those who know its history, it holds a permanent chill. It is a place where, for one terrifying night, the modern world was peeled back to reveal something ancient, primal, and deeply monstrous. Ultimately, the identity of the Atlas vampire is likely lost to time forever. He was most probably one of Lily Lindstrom's many anonymous clients, a man who walked into her apartment one night and revealed himself to be a monster. He may have been a local or a foreigner, a doctor or a laborer, a cop or a clerk. He could have been anyone. After committing his horrific ritualistic crime, he simply walked back out the door and dissolved back into the anonymity of the city, taking his dark secrets with him. He may have gone on to live a long, normal life, his monstrous act a single secret chapter in an otherwise unremarkable story. Or perhaps he struck again, his crimes in other cities never being linked back to the unique horror of the Atlas case. We will never know. And it is this profound lack of an answer that gives the case its enduring power. The Atlas vampire is not a man. He is a question mark. He represents the terrifying reality that sometimes there is no rational explanation for human cruelty, no satisfying motive to be found. Sometimes there is only the act itself, a moment of pure, incomprehensible darkness that leaves behind a permanent scar on a city's soul. The Phantom of Stockholm remains at large in our collective imagination, a chilling testament to a crime that was as bizarre as it was brutal, and as perfect as it was evil. The case of the silent twins, the chilling case of the Atlas vampire, is a story about a singular, monstrous act that defied rational explanation. But some of the most profound psychological mysteries are not about a single act of violence against another. They are about a shared internal world so intense and so insular that it ultimately leads to self-destruction. This is a story about two people, a pair of identical twins, who created a private reality so complete that it eventually became a prison. It's a story about a silent pact, a bizarre crime spree, and a final, chilling decision that remains one of the most baffling and tragic cases in the annals of psychology and crime. This is the strange and haunting story of June and Jennifer Gibbons, the silent twins. The story begins not in a world of crime, but in the quiet, isolating landscape of childhood. June and Jennifer Gibbons were born in 1963 in Barbados, but their family soon moved to Wales, seeking better opportunities. They were the only black children in their small, predominantly white community, and from a very young age, they were subjected to intense bullying and racism. In response to this hostile outside world, the twins began to retreat, turning inward and creating a world of their own. This retreat was not just a typical childhood closeness. It was an extreme and pathological bond. They developed their own private, high-speed dialect, a kind of twin language that was incomprehensible to anyone else. They began to refuse to speak to anyone outside of their twinship, not to their parents, not to their siblings, and not to their teachers. They became elective mutes, a condition where a person is physically capable of speech but chooses not to speak in certain social situations. But for June and Jennifer, it was not a choice made in certain situations. It was a total and absolute pact of silence with the outside world. Their silence was not passive. It was a powerful, active force. They would move in perfect, eerie synchronicity, mirroring each other's actions. If one twin started to walk, the other would start at the exact same moment. If one folded her arms, the other would do the same. They were like two halves of a single being, their individual identities completely submerged in their shared one. For their family and for the school system, they were a profound and deeply worrying puzzle. They were sent to numerous therapists and specialists, but no one could break their silent code. Any attempt to separate them, even for a few moments, would result in a violent, almost catatonic reaction from both. Girls, as they moved into their teenage years, their private world became even more elaborate and intense. They were taken out of school and spent their days locked in their bedroom, a small world that became their entire universe. It was here that their immense intelligence and creativity, which had been stifled by their silence, found an outlet. They began to write. They voraciously read books and then, using the money they received from government benefits, they ordered a creative writing course through the mail. They began to produce a staggering amount of written work. They wrote poems, short stories, and, most significantly, full-length novels. Their writing was often dark, filled with themes of crime, passion, and psychological turmoil. Jennifer's novel, The Pugilist, told the story of a doctor who tries to save his son's life by transplanting the heart of the family dog into him, only for the dog's spirit to take over the boy. June's novel, The Pepsi-Cola Addict, was a story about a teenager's doomed romance with his teacher. Their writing was a window into their rich, complex, and often disturbing inner lives, a world they would share with no one but each other. They kept detailed, voluminous diaries, thousands of pages in which they documented their daily lives, their fantasies, and the intense, complex, and often toxic nature of their relationship. These diaries, which would later be discovered, revealed a shocking truth. Their silent, synchronized world was not a peaceful sanctuary. It was a battlefield. Their bond was a strange and volatile mixture of intense love and profound hatred. They were each other's best friend and worst enemy, their greatest comfort and their most bitter rival. Their diaries describe a relationship governed by a bizarre set of rules and power dynamics. One twin would often be dominant, while the other was submissive. They would switch these roles back and forth. They wrote about their deep, desperate desire to be normal, to be seen as individuals, but also their profound, paralyzing fear of being separated. They were trapped in a psychological feedback loop, a folie à deux, where their shared isolation and fantasy life reinforced each other's strange behaviors. The diaries also revealed a dark and disturbing secret. The twins had come to believe that it was impossible for both of them to truly live a normal life as long as the other was alive. A chilling pact was formed. One of them, they decided, would eventually have to die so that the other could be free. They wrote about this with a strange, matter-of-fact detachment. "No one suffers as we do," Jennifer wrote. "We are not like other people. We have a fatal illness." As they entered their late teens, their creative internal world was no longer enough. A new, destructive energy began to emerge. They were desperate for some kind of real-world experience, for love, for recognition. But their inability to communicate with the outside world made this impossible. Their frustration began to manifest in a series of self-destructive and criminal acts. They began to commit petty crimes, shoplifting, vandalism. Then their crimes escalated. They started a series of arsons, setting fire to several buildings in their local community. It was a cry for help disguised as an act of destruction. They wanted to be caught. They wanted the outside world to finally break through their silent prison. In 1981, their crime spree finally came to an end. They were arrested for arson and burglary. At their trial, the court was faced with a profound dilemma. These were not typical criminals. They were two deeply disturbed young women, trapped in a psychological world that no one could understand. The judge, unable to sentence them to a standard prison, made a fateful decision. He ordered them to be committed indefinitely to Broadmoor, the same high-security psychiatric hospital that had once housed the teacup poisoner, Graham Young. June and Jennifer Gibbons, the silent twins, were about to enter the most famous and most feared mental institution in Britain. They were being sent there for treatment, for a chance to be separated and perhaps find a path back to normalcy. But Broadmoor was not a place of healing for them. It would become the final tragic stage for their silent, deadly pact, a place where their shared fantasy would finally, and horrifically, become a reality. The committal of June and Jennifer Gibbons to Broadmoor Hospital in 1982 marked a dark and decisive turning point in their lives. They were just 19 years old. This institution, designed to house and treat the most dangerous and mentally disturbed criminals in Britain, was a world away from the quiet, isolated bedroom where they had spent their formative years. The hope was that the structured environment and intensive psychiatric care of Broadmoor could finally break their silent pact and help them to build separate, individual identities. But the reality was far different. For the twins, Broadmoor became a new kind of prison, one that was even more isolating and psychologically damaging than the one they had built for themselves. Upon their arrival, the hospital staff immediately tried to implement the one strategy that every other therapist had attempted: separation. They were placed in separate wards, on opposite sides of the massive hospital complex. The goal was to force them to interact with other people, to develop their own voices and their own relationships. But the twins' bond was far stronger and more pathological than the doctors had anticipated. The separation did not free them. It plunged them into a state of near catatonia. They would often refuse to eat, to move, or to speak to anyone. They would stand frozen in place for hours, like living statues, waiting for the moment they could be reunited. The staff, realizing that the forced separation was causing more harm than good, eventually had to relent, allowing them to have supervised contact and, eventually, placing them in closer proximity. Their life in Broadmoor was a strange and tormented one. They continued to live within their own private world, their silent communication a source of constant frustration and fascination for the hospital staff. They filled dozens of diaries with their thoughts, their poems, and their elaborate fantasies. These diaries, which were later studied by journalists and psychologists, provide a chilling and heartbreaking window into their shared psychosis. The central, recurring theme of their writings was the toxic push-and-pull nature of their relationship. They were locked in a perpetual power struggle, a symbiotic relationship that was both a source of immense comfort and unbearable torment. Their diaries are filled with passages of deep, profound love and admiration for each other, followed immediately by passages of intense, violent hatred. "I am a dark shadow of my sister," June wrote. "I want to be her, and I want to be free of her." Jennifer's writings were even more visceral. "We have become fatal enemies in each other's eyes," she wrote. "We feel the irritating deadly rays come out of our bodies, stinging each other. I say to myself, can I get rid of my own shadow? Will I ever be free? Or will I die with my shadow at my side?" This idea that one of them had to die for the other to be free was not just a piece of dramatic Gothic fantasy. It was a deeply held core belief, a pact that they had made with each other years before. They came to see their twinship not as a bond, but as a form of possession. Each twin believed that the other was stealing her life force, her breath, her very soul. They believed that as long as they were both alive, neither of them could ever be a whole, complete person. This deadly pact manifested in acts of real-world violence against each other. They would have sudden, explosive fights trying to choke or drown one another, only to be pulled apart by hospital staff. These were not simple sibling squabbles. They were, in their minds, desperate attempts to fulfill the pact and achieve their freedom. During their 11 years in Broadmoor, they were subjected to a wide range of treatments, including high doses of antipsychotic medications. The drugs seemed to dull their senses and make them more docile, but they did nothing to break the underlying psychological bond. Their case was a profound puzzle to the psychiatric community. Were they schizophrenic? Did they suffer from a shared psychotic disorder, a folie à deux? Or was their condition something else entirely, a unique and extreme manifestation of the twin relationship that defied easy diagnosis? One person who managed to gain a small degree of their trust was a journalist and author named Marjorie Wallace. Wallace became fascinated by their case and began to visit them regularly at Broadmoor. Over time, the twins began to communicate with her, sometimes speaking, sometimes passing her notes. They gave her access to their voluminous diaries, trusting her to tell their story to the outside world. Wallace's work would become the basis for her definitive book on the twins, The Silent Twins, which brought their strange and tragic story to a wider audience. It was to Marjorie Wallace that the twins finally confided the details of their chilling pact. In one of their conversations, Jennifer looked directly at Wallace and said, in her quiet, hesitant voice, "Marjorie, Marjorie, I'm going to have to die." When Wallace asked why, Jennifer replied simply, "Because we decided." She explained that they had come to a final mutual agreement. It was Jennifer who would be the one to make the ultimate sacrifice. She had decided that she would die so that June could be free to live a normal life. June, who was present during this conversation, simply nodded in agreement. It was a calm, rational discussion of a horrifying, irrational plan. In 1993, after 11 long years at Broadmoor, the hospital authorities made a decision. They had concluded that they could do no more for the twins. Their condition had not significantly improved, but they were no longer considered a danger to the public. A decision was made to transfer them to a lower security clinic in Wales, a place called the Caswell Clinic, which was closer to their family's home. It was seen as a step towards a potential eventual release. The day of the transfer arrived. As they were preparing to leave Broadmoor, the place that had been their prison for over a decade, Jennifer seemed to be in a strange, peaceful state. She reportedly laid her head on June's shoulder during the journey and said, "At last, we're out." But Marjorie Wallace, who had spoken to them just before they left, noted that Jennifer seemed weak and unwell. They arrived at the Caswell Clinic in Wales. Within hours of their arrival, Jennifer Gibbons suddenly collapsed. She was rushed to a nearby hospital, but it was too late. She was pronounced dead. She was just 29 years old. The death of Jennifer Gibbons was a profound shock to everyone involved. She had been given a full physical examination just before leaving Broadmoor and had been found to be in good health. The autopsy was a complete and utter mystery. There were no signs of poison in her system. There were no signs of a struggle or foul play. Her body showed no discernible cause of death. The official cause was listed as acute myocarditis, a sudden, unexplained inflammation of the heart. But for June and for Marjorie Wallace, the cause of death was no mystery at all. Jennifer had simply willed herself to die. She had fulfilled her part of the pact. She had sacrificed her own life so that her sister, her other half, her fatal enemy, could finally be free. The silent, deadly promise that had been made in the isolation of their childhood bedroom had finally, and tragically, been kept. The twinship had been broken, not by doctors or by therapy, but by a final, inexplicable act of will. The sudden and inexplicable death of Jennifer Gibbons, just hours after being transferred from Broadmoor, was the final, tragic culmination of the twins' dark and obsessive pact. For the medical and legal authorities, her death was a baffling anomaly. A healthy young woman's heart had simply stopped for no discernible reason. But for June Gibbons, it was a moment of profound and terrifying liberation. The fatal illness that Jennifer had spoken of had run its course. The shadow was gone. In the days and weeks that followed her sister's death, June's transformation was nothing short of miraculous. It was as if a switch had been flipped. The silent, withdrawn, almost catatonic woman who had spent over a decade locked away in a high-security hospital began to emerge from her shell. Almost immediately, she began to speak. She talked to the nurses, to the doctors, and to Marjorie Wallace, her voice no longer the hesitant, high-pitched whisper of her past, but a clear, normal tone. The elective mutism that had defined her entire life had vanished with her sister's last breath. She described the experience of Jennifer's death with a chilling, matter-of-fact clarity. "I'm free at last, liberated," she reportedly told Marjorie Wallace. "And at last Jennifer has given up her life for me." She seemed to be in a state of quiet relief, unburdened for the first time in her life from the irritating deadly rays that she believed had emanated from her twin. June was not immediately released. She remained at the Caswell Clinic for about a year, where she continued to make remarkable progress. The psychiatric staff observed a woman who was slowly, tentatively learning how to be an individual. She no longer moved in perfect synchronicity with an invisible partner. She began to make her own decisions, to express her own opinions, and to engage with the world as a singular person. The psychological prison that she and her sister had built together had crumbled. After her release, June Gibbons quietly returned to live with her family in Wales. She has, for the most part, lived a private life, away from the glare of the media that was so fascinated by her and her sister's story. She has made a conscious effort to integrate into the community, to live the normal life that she and Jennifer had both so desperately craved and so tragically believed was impossible for them to share. She has never wavered from her belief that Jennifer's death was a necessary sacrifice, a final, loving gift from one twin to another, the only way to break their destructive bond. The story of the silent twins remains one of the most compelling and confounding cases in the history of psychology. It is a profound and tragic exploration of the mysteries of identity, love, and the unique, powerful, and sometimes dangerous nature of the twin relationship. The case raises a host of difficult questions that defy easy answers. What was the true nature of their condition? Was it a severe form of shared psychotic disorder, folie à deux, where two individuals, isolated from the world, create and reinforce a shared delusional system? Was it a product of the intense racism and social isolation they experienced as children, a defense mechanism that became a pathological prison? Or was it something else entirely, a unique psychological phenomenon that our current understanding of the human mind cannot fully explain? And what of Jennifer's death? How did she die? The official medical explanation of acute myocarditis feels incomplete. It describes what happened to her heart, but it doesn't explain why. Is it medically possible for a person to will themselves to die, for a psychological state to trigger a fatal physiological event? The idea is controversial, but there are documented cases of psychogenic death, where individuals under extreme emotional or psychological stress have died without any other apparent cause. It's possible that Jennifer, having made the final, resolute decision to die, was able to, through some unknown psychosomatic process, simply shut her own body down. It is a chilling and profound testament to the power of the mind over the body. The legacy of June and Jennifer Gibbons is a tragic and cautionary one. Their story highlights the immense challenges faced by the psychiatric system when confronted with a case so complex and so unique. The decision to commit them to Broadmoor, a high-security institution filled with violent criminals, is now seen by many as a catastrophic failure. They were not, in the traditional sense, criminals who needed to be punished, but two deeply disturbed and frightened young women who needed intensive, specialized therapeutic care. The harsh, institutional environment of Broadmoor likely exacerbated their condition, reinforcing their sense of isolation and their belief that the outside world was a hostile place. Their prolific writings, the diaries, the poems, the novels, remain as a powerful and haunting record of their inner lives. They are a testament to the immense creativity and intelligence that was trapped within their silent world. Their stories are filled with a desperate yearning for love, for acceptance, and for a normal life, the very things their pathological bond made impossible for them to achieve. June Gibbons, now in her 60s, continues to live a quiet life, no longer a silent twin, but simply a woman. She carries with her the memory of her other half, a memory that is a complex mixture of love, pain, and a profound sense of liberation. Her freedom, she believes, was bought at the ultimate price. The story of the silent twins is a journey into the deepest, most mysterious corners of human identity. It is a heartbreaking story about two souls who were so inextricably linked that they could not exist apart, and yet they could not truly live together. Their silent pact, made in the secret language of their childhood, was a bond that proved to be stronger than any therapy, any medication, and even the walls of Broadmoor. In the end, it was a pact that could only be broken by death itself, a final, silent act in one of the most tragic and unforgettable psychological dramas of our time. The abduction and murder of Marion Parker, the tragic case of the silent twins, is a story about a dark, internal world, a psychological prison built by two people. But some of the most horrifying crimes are not about internal worlds. They are about a brutal external violation of the most sacred trust a family has, the safety of their children. This is a story that takes place in the glittering, sun-drenched Los Angeles of the Roaring Twenties, a city of boundless optimism and burgeoning celebrity. But beneath the glamour, it's a story about a crime so cold, so cruel, and so shocking in its final, horrific act that it terrified a nation and forever changed the way parents looked at the world outside their door. This is the heartbreaking and monstrous case of the abduction and murder of Marion Parker. The Parker family, in the winter of 1927, was a picture of a prominent and successful Los Angeles family. Perry Parker was a respected banker, a chief clerk at the Perry National Bank. He and his wife, Lucy, lived in a beautiful, stately home in the upscale Lafayette Square neighborhood with their twin 12-year-old daughters, Marjorie and Marion. Marion was described as a bright, sweet, and intelligent girl, known for her beautiful singing voice and her kind nature. She was the beloved child of a wealthy and powerful family, living a life of privilege and security. On the morning of December 15, 1927, Marion was at school at the Mount Vernon Junior High School. It was a normal school day, just before the Christmas holiday. In the middle of the day, a man walked into the office of the school's registrar. He was a well-dressed, respectable-looking man who appeared to be in his 30s. He told the registrar that his name was Mr. Cooper and that he worked with Perry Parker at the bank. He explained with a calm and convincing urgency that Mr. Parker had been in a terrible streetcar accident and was now in the hospital, and that his dying wish was to see his daughter Marion. The school registrar, completely taken in by the man's story and his professional demeanor, believed him without question. This was an era of greater trust, a time before the modern protocols of checking identification and making confirmation phone calls were standard practice. The registrar went to Marion's classroom, pulled her out of her lessons, and told her that her father had been in a serious accident and that this man was there to take her to him. Marion, terrified for her father, went with the man without hesitation. He led her out of the school and into his waiting car, a dark-colored coupe. He then drove away. It was a kidnapping of stunning simplicity and audacity, executed in broad daylight from the supposed safety of a school. Later that afternoon, when Perry Parker returned home from a perfectly normal day at the bank, he was met with a horrifying realization. There had been no accident. His daughter had been abducted. A short time later, the first communication from the kidnapper arrived. It was a telegram sent to the Parker home. The message was cold and demanding. It confirmed that he had Marion and demanded a ransom of $1,500 in $20 gold certificates. It warned Parker not to contact the police, threatening that if he did, Marion would be killed. The note was signed simply, "The Fox." Perry Parker was now faced with an impossible choice, a choice that has been the torment of every parent of a kidnapped child. Should he trust the police and risk the kidnapper's wrath, or should he pay the ransom and hope for his daughter's safe return? He chose to trust the police. He immediately contacted the Los Angeles Police Department, and a massive but secret investigation was launched. The next day, a second letter from the Fox arrived. It was a long, rambling, and strangely literate letter, filled with taunts and further instructions. The Fox again warned Parker against involving the police and outlined a complex plan for the ransom drop. The letter also contained a chilling addition, a postscript written in the small, neat handwriting of Marion Parker herself. It read, "Daddy, I want to come home. Please do what this man says." It was a heartbreaking plea, a proof of life that only intensified the family's terror. The police and Perry Parker decided to play along with the kidnapper's demands. They gathered the $1,500 in gold certificates, carefully recording the serial numbers. The Fox's instructions for the ransom drop were complex and designed to test Parker's obedience. He was instructed to drive to a specific intersection in the city and wait for a signal. On the evening of December 17th, 2 days after the abduction, Perry Parker drove alone to the designated meeting spot. He waited in his car, the bag of ransom money on the seat beside him. A car approached and a man inside, his face partially obscured by a handkerchief, pointed a shotgun at him. He ordered Parker to throw the money out of the window. Parker complied, throwing the bag of cash out onto the street. He then pleaded with the man, Please, give me my daughter back." The kidnapper gestured to the passenger seat of his own car. In the dim light, Parker could see a figure sitting there, bundled up in blankets. He could see his daughter's face. She seemed to be alive, though strangely still. "Here she is," the kidnapper said. He then slammed his foot on the accelerator and sped off into the night, leaving Perry Parker alone on the dark street. Parker rushed to the spot where he had seen his daughter. But when he reached the bundled figure, he was met with a scene of almost unimaginable horror. It was his daughter, Marion, but she was not alive. Her body was lifeless. Her arms and legs had been cut off. The body was just a torso, disemboweled and stuffed with old rags to give it the shape of a whole person. Her eyes had been wired open to create the horrifying illusion that she was still alive. It was an act of cruelty so monstrous and so sadistic that it defied comprehension. The fox had not just murdered a child. He had mutilated her body and then used it as a gruesome puppet in a final, torturous act of psychological warfare against her father. The discovery of Marion Parker's mutilated body transformed the case from a kidnapping into one of the most infamous and horrifying murders in American history. The city of Los Angeles was gripped by a mixture of outrage and terror. The police, who had been investigating the case secretly, now launched a massive public manhunt for the killer who called himself the Fox. The search for the rest of Marion's remains began. Her limbs were found a day later, wrapped in newspaper and discarded in a park in another part of the city. The autopsy would reveal that she had likely been killed shortly after she was abducted, her death caused by the trauma of the dismemberment itself. She had been alive when her killer began to cut off her arms and legs. The manhunt for the Fox became the largest in the history of the West Coast. A massive reward was offered. The police were under immense pressure to find the monster who had committed this unspeakable crime. Their investigation would lead them to a suspect, a man whose own story was a strange and pathetic tale of failed ambition and monstrous depravity. A man who, in his quest for easy money, had committed a crime that would forever be remembered for its singular, shocking cruelty. The brutal murder and mutilation of 12-year-old Marion Parker sent a shockwave of horror not just through Los Angeles, but across the entire nation. The crime was a grotesque violation of every societal norm, and the public outcry for justice was immense. The Los Angeles Police Department, under the leadership of the legendary Chief James Two Gun Davis, launched one of the most extensive and highly publicized manhunts the country had ever seen. The killer, who had so arrogantly named himself the Fox, was now the most wanted man in America. The investigation, however, had very little to go on. The only description of the killer came from the school registrar and from Perry Parker's brief, terrifying encounter at the ransom drop. Both described a young, well-dressed, and seemingly educated white man. The kidnapper's long, taunting letters were also a key piece of evidence. They were analyzed by handwriting experts, who determined that the author was intelligent and literate, but also deeply narcissistic and psychologically disturbed. The first major break in the case came from the physical evidence left behind by the killer. The towels that had been used to wrap Marion's dismembered limbs were traced back to the laundry mark of the Bellevue Arms, an apartment building in downtown Los Angeles. This was a critical lead. The police immediately descended on the building, beginning a meticulous, room-by-room search and interviewing every resident. It was in this apartment building that they found their suspect. A resident reported that a man who had recently moved into one of the apartments had been acting suspiciously. The man, who went by the name Donald Evans, fit the general physical description of the kidnapper. He had abruptly checked out of his apartment just after the murder was discovered. When police searched his abandoned apartment, they found a trove of incriminating evidence. They found discarded pieces of wire, the same kind used to wire Marion Parker's eyes open. They found scraps of the newspaper that had been used to wrap her limbs. And most damningly, they found a copy of the ransom note. The Fox had made a mistake. The police now had a name, or at least an alias. They quickly discovered that Donald Evans was not his real name. Fingerprints lifted from the apartment were matched to a man with a criminal record named William Edward Hickman. William Edward Hickman was a 19-year-old young man whose life story was a pathetic and chilling prelude to his monstrous crime. He was intelligent and had been a promising student in high school, but he was also a young man with a deep-seated sense of grievance and a warped sense of entitlement. He had previously worked as a messenger at the very bank where Perry Parker was a chief clerk. Hickman had been arrested and charged with forgery and theft from the bank, a crime for which Perry Parker had testified against him. Hickman was convicted but was given a lenient sentence due to his age. He held a deep and simmering resentment against Parker, blaming him for his legal troubles and his subsequent inability to get a good job. The motive for the crime now seemed horrifyingly clear. It was not just about the money. It was an act of personal, sadistic revenge against Perry Parker, the man Hickman saw as the architect of his failures. He had chosen Parker's daughter, Marion, not at random, but as the specific target of his rage. With their suspect identified, the manhunt for William Edward Hickman intensified. His photograph was plastered on the front page of every newspaper in the country. He was a fugitive on the run with the $1,500 in ransom money. The police tracked his movements across the country. He had purchased a car and was heading east. The entire nation was on the lookout for the Fox killer. The manhunt came to an end a week later, on December 22nd, in the state of Oregon. 2 police officers in the small town of Echo spotted a car that matched the description of Hickman's vehicle. They pulled him over. Hickman, who was armed, surrendered without a fight. His grand, arrogant crime had ended with a simple traffic stop on a cold winter morning. In his pockets, the police found the marked $20 gold certificates from the ransom payment. Hickman was extradited back to Los Angeles to face trial. The public was baying for his blood, but Hickman, far from being a repentant or terrified young man, seemed to revel in the attention. He was arrogant, talkative, and completely devoid of any apparent remorse. He confessed to the kidnapping and the murder, but his story was a bizarre and self-serving narrative designed to mitigate his own guilt. He claimed that he had not originally intended to kill Marion. He told a fantastical story, alleging that he was not the mastermind of the plot, but was just a pawn working for a man he called the all-seeing eye. He claimed he had been forced to commit the crime. He also claimed that he had not dismembered Marion while she was alive. He insisted that she had died of fright in the back of his car, and that he had only dismembered her body afterwards because it was too difficult to move in one piece. The autopsy, however, told a different story. The medical examiner was adamant that the dismemberment had begun while Marion was still alive, that the shock and blood loss from her limbs being severed was the actual cause of her death. This fact, more than any other, cemented the image of Hickman as a monster of almost unimaginable cruelty. Hickman's trial was one of the biggest media events of the Roaring Twenties. His defense team, faced with an undeniable confession and overwhelming physical evidence, had only one possible strategy: the insanity defense. They argued that Hickman was not evil, but mad. They brought in psychiatrists who testified that he was suffering from a split personality and was not in control of his actions. They tried to portray him as a victim of his own diseased mind. The prosecution, in turn, portrayed him as a cold, calculating, and perfectly sane killer. They pointed to the meticulous planning of the kidnapping, the clever construction of the ransom notes, and his careful attempts to avoid capture as proof of a rational mind at work. They argued that his claims of being a pawn in a larger conspiracy were nothing more than a desperate, self-serving lie. They painted a picture of a young man with a massive ego and a deep-seated grudge, who had committed a monstrous act of revenge and was now trying to escape the consequences. The trial became a public spectacle, a debate not just about Hickman's guilt, but about the very nature of evil itself. Was he a madman, a victim of a broken mind? Or was he a moral imbecile, a person simply born without a conscience, a person who knew the difference between right and wrong but simply did not care? The jury would be asked to decide the fate of the man who had horrified a nation, the young, well-dressed monster who had called himself the Fox. Their verdict would bring an end to one of the most sensational and disturbing crime sagas of the era. The trial of William Edward Hickman was a spectacle that held the nation captive. The defense's argument that he was legally insane was the only path they could take, but it was a difficult one to argue in the face of Hickman's own lucid and often arrogant behavior. His elaborate, self-serving stories about being a pawn for a mysterious figure named the All-Seeing Eye were seen by the prosecution, and by most of the public, not as the delusions of a madman, but as the cunning lies of a cornered predator. The prosecution methodically dismantled the insanity defense. They presented the evidence of Hickman's careful planning, his prior connection to the Parker family, his knowledge of the bank, the detailed and literate ransom notes, and his calculated flight across the country. These were not the actions of a man who was out of touch with reality. This was the work of a cold, rational, and goal-oriented mind. The jury agreed. After a trial that lasted just over a month, they took less than an hour to find William Edward Hickman guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict was delivered in February of 1928. Under the laws of the time, the jury's verdict came with a mandatory sentence: death. Hickman's reaction to the verdict was one of stunned disbelief. The arrogant, confident facade he had maintained throughout the trial finally cracked. He had genuinely seemed to believe that his stories and the insanity plea would save him. He was sentenced to be executed by hanging at San Quentin State Prison. In the months leading up to his execution, Hickman's case went through a series of appeals, all of which were denied. He remained a figure of intense public fascination. He gave numerous interviews from death row, continuing to spin his strange, contradictory tales. He never showed any genuine remorse for the murder of Marion Parker. His primary emotion seemed to be a narcissistic sense of frustration that his own brilliance had not been properly recognized and that his plan had failed. On the morning of October 19, 1928, less than a year after he had abducted Marion Parker from her school, William Edward Hickman was led to the gallows at San Quentin. He was just 20 years old. He went to his death calmly. The fox had been run to ground. The legacy of the Marion Parker case was profound and long-lasting. The crime had a seismic impact on American society, particularly on the consciousness of parents. The sheer audacity of the kidnapping, a child taken from the supposed safety of her school in broad daylight, shattered a sense of security that had been taken for granted. The case led to a nationwide reevaluation of school security protocols. The simple, trusting days when a stranger could walk into a school and remove a child with a plausible story were over. New rules regarding identification, parental contact, and student release were implemented in schools across the country, a direct and lasting legacy of Marion's tragic death. The case also had a significant impact on the relationship between law enforcement and the press. The intense, sensationalist media coverage of the manhunt and the trial created a new template for the crime of the century narrative. The LAPD, under Chief James Davis, used the media masterfully to galvanize public support and to aid in the manhunt, but they also struggled to control the flow of information. The case highlighted the new and powerful role that the modern media would play in high-profile criminal investigations. For the Parker family, there was no true closure. The execution of William Hickman brought a form of legal justice, but it could never erase the horror of what had been done to their daughter. They were forced to endure not only the loss of their child in the most brutal way imaginable, but also the public spectacle of the investigation and the trial. They eventually moved from the house on Jackson Boulevard, seeking to escape the memories that haunted it. They lived the rest of their lives in private, forever marked by the tragedy. The story of Marion Parker has endured as one of the most infamous crimes of the 20th century. It is a story that is remembered not just for its brutality, but for its profound and calculated cruelty. The image of Hickman holding up the mutilated torso of Marion in the passenger seat, her eyes wired open to create a horrifying illusion of life, is one of the most disturbing images in the annals of American crime. It was an act of psychological torture so monstrous that it has become a benchmark for depravity. The case stands as a chilling study in the psychology of a certain kind of killer. William Edward Hickman was not a simple brute. He was intelligent, articulate, and charismatic. He was a young man who felt that the world had wronged him, and he possessed a narcissistic rage so profound that he believed it gave him the right to commit an act of unspeakable evil as a form of revenge. He was a monster who wore the mask of a respectable young man. The name he chose for himself, the Fox, was a telling one. It spoke to his own self-image as a cunning, clever predator who could outwit society. But in the end, his cleverness was no match for the determined work of law enforcement and the outrage of an entire nation. His crime, for all its horrifying audacity, was ultimately a pathetic and desperate act, the work of a failed young man who sought to achieve a sense of power and significance through the destruction of an innocent child. The story of the Fox and Marion Parker is a dark and cautionary tale, a permanent reminder of the terrible violence that can erupt when a sense of personal grievance is allowed to curdle into a monstrous and unforgivable act of evil. The mystery of the jammed radio station, the horrific case of Marion Parker, is a story of a crime with a clear and monstrous perpetrator. But some of the most enduring mysteries are those where the perpetrator is not a person, but an invisible phantom signal. This is a story that unfolds not in a dark alley or a quiet home, but on the airwaves themselves. It's a story about a television station that was hijacked by a ghost in the machine, a bizarre act of signal intrusion that terrified a city and left behind a cryptic, distorted message from a person or a group that has never been identified. This is the strange and unsettling case of the Max Headroom broadcast signal intrusion. Chicago, Illinois, on the night of November 22, 1987, was a city settling in for a quiet Sunday evening. Families were gathered around their television sets, watching their local news and primetime shows. At WGN-TV Channel 9, the 9 p.m. news was underway. The sports anchor, Dan Roan, was in the middle of a segment, recapping the highlights of that day's Chicago Bears game. It was a completely normal, routine broadcast, seen by tens of thousands of people across the city. Suddenly, without any warning, the screen went black. For a few brief, disorienting seconds, there was only static. And then, a new image appeared. It was a strange, almost grotesque figure, a man wearing a rubbery, smiling mask with sunglasses. He was standing in front of a corrugated metal background that seemed to be rocking back and forth. There was no clear audio, only a loud, buzzing, distorted noise. The figure bobbed and weaved in a jerky, unsettling motion. For 25 surreal seconds, this bizarre image controlled the airwaves of one of Chicago's biggest television stations. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The station engineers at WGN, scrambling in a state of confusion, managed to switch to a backup transmitter, and the broadcast returned to the newsroom. A flustered Dan Roan appeared back on screen, saying, "Well, if you're wondering what's happened, so am I." The incident was bizarre and unprecedented. It was a clear act of broadcast signal intrusion, a pirate signal that had been powerful enough to overpower the station's own broadcast signal to its transmitter atop the Hancock Center. It was a high-tech prank, a piece of electronic graffiti. It was strange, but it was seen as a one-off event, a clever but harmless act of technological mischief. The story was a minor local curiosity, but the hijacker, it seemed, was not finished. His main event was yet to come. 2 hours later, around 11:20 p.m., a different Chicago television station was on the air. It was WTTW, the local PBS affiliate, Channel 11. They were in the middle of a broadcast of the popular British science fiction show, Doctor Who. The episode was The Horror of Fong Rock. Suddenly, the screen went blank. The phantom hijacker was back, and this time, he was prepared for a longer performance. The same figure appeared on the screen, the man in the strange, smiling mask, standing in front of the same corrugated metal background. But this time there was audio. It was distorted, garbled, and deeply strange, a rambling stream of consciousness monologue that was both nonsensical and vaguely menacing. The figure in the mask was meant to be a crude impersonation of Max Headroom, a popular and futuristic computer-generated television personality from the 1980s known for his glitched, stuttering speech and satirical humor. But this was a dark, twisted, funhouse mirror version of Max Headroom. The figure began to speak in a distorted, high-pitched voice. He made a series of bizarre, disconnected statements. He mocked the WGN sports anchor he had just interrupted, calling him a frickin' liberal, and making a strange reference to a greatest world newspaper slogan used by the Tribune Company, WGN's owner. He hummed the theme song to a popular cartoon, Clutch Cargo. He held up a Pepsi can while saying the word Coke, a nod to a current ad campaign. His monologue was a strange, chaotic collage of 1980s pop culture references, inside jokes, and what seemed to be the ramblings of a disturbed mind. The scene then escalated from strange to deeply vulgar and unsettling. The figure took off the mask briefly, revealing a man's face, his features obscured by the poor lighting and the mask's rubbery residue. He then put the mask back on. He continued his strange monologue, and then the scene took its most infamous turn. The figure bent over, his bare buttocks exposed to the camera. Another person, a woman whose face was not seen, then began to spank him with a fly swatter. The figure screamed in a high-pitched, distorted wail. After this final, bizarre act of crude performance art, the screen went black. The broadcast returned to the Doctor Who episode. The entire intrusion had lasted for about 90 seconds. The engineers at WTTW were powerless to stop it. Unlike WGN, which had its transmitter at the top of a skyscraper, WTTW's transmitter was unmanned and located in a different building. By the time they could send an engineer to try and counteract the signal, the hijacking was over. The Max Headroom incident was no longer just a local curiosity. It was a major national story. The city of Chicago was both amused and deeply unsettled. Who had done this, and how? The technical skill required to pull off such a broadcast signal intrusion was significant. The perpetrator or perpetrators would have needed a powerful transmitter, a line of sight to the station's broadcast antennas, and a sophisticated understanding of broadcast engineering. This was not the work of a casual prankster. This was a person with a high level of technical expertise. The FBI and the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, immediately launched a full-scale investigation. The crime was a federal offense, and the authorities took it very seriously. They worried that if a person could hijack a television signal to broadcast a bizarre prank, they could just as easily broadcast a more dangerous or panic-inducing message. The hunt for the Max Headroom hacker was on. The investigation began by trying to pinpoint the source of the pirate signal. Because the signal had to be line of sight to the broadcast towers, the FBI was able to narrow down the potential location of the hijacker's transmitter to a wide arc of high-rise buildings and warehouses in the Chicago area. But this was still a massive search area. They interviewed employees at both television stations, looking for any disgruntled engineers or former employees who might have the knowledge and the motive to carry out such an attack. They looked into the local hacker and phreaker communities, a small but active subculture of tech-savvy individuals who delighted in exploring and exploiting technological systems. But the case was a ghost hunt. The perpetrators had been invisible, their signal a phantom that had appeared and then vanished. They had left behind no physical evidence, only the bizarre and unsettling videotape of their 90-second performance. The video itself was analyzed frame by frame. The distorted audio was cleaned up and dissected, but it offered few clues. The identity of the man in the mask and the woman with the fly swatter remained a complete mystery. The case was a perfect anonymous crime, a high-tech prank that had managed to baffle the highest levels of law enforcement. The Max Headroom incident had become a legend, a piece of pre-internet viral folklore, and the identity of the person behind the mask would become one of the most enduring unsolved mysteries of the broadcast era. The Max Headroom broadcast intrusion of 1987 was a crime that was, in many ways, ahead of its time. In an era before the internet and viral videos, it was a profound and unsettling demonstration of how technology could be used to hijack the public consciousness. The FBI and the FCC, tasked with solving the case, were faced with a unique set of challenges. They were hunting for a perpetrator who was not a traditional criminal, but a new breed of high-tech phantom. The investigation focused heavily on the technical aspects of the crime. The act of overpowering a major television station's broadcast signal is not a simple one. The hijacker would have needed a powerful microwave transmitter, a dish antenna, and a significant amount of technical expertise to aim their signal precisely at the station's studio-to-transmitter microwave links. This suggested the perpetrator was likely an engineer, a technician, or a highly advanced hobbyist with a background in broadcast technology or satellite communications. The FBI canvassed electronics stores, looking for any unusual sales of high-powered broadcast equipment. They investigated local engineering schools and tech companies. They also delved deep into Chicago's burgeoning hacker subculture. This was the era of the freakers and the early computer hackers, a small, close-knit community of tech-savvy individuals who explored the boundaries of the newly emerging digital world. Many of them were brilliant anti-authoritarian and delighted in pulling off clever pranks to expose the vulnerabilities of large corporations and government systems. The Max Headroom incident, with its satirical, anti-corporate tone, seemed to fit perfectly within this subculture. One of the most promising leads came from within this community. A man who was a regular at a series of local hacker meetups was known to have a strange sense of humor and a fascination with broadcast technology. He also bore a physical resemblance to the unmasked man seen briefly in the video. This individual was brought in for questioning and became a primary person of interest. However, he denied any involvement, and the police could never find any direct, physical evidence, such as the mask or the corrugated metal background, to link him to the crime. The case against him was purely circumstantial, and he was never charged. The video of the intrusion itself became the central piece of evidence, a 90-second artifact that was dissected and analyzed endlessly by both law enforcement and the public. The identity of the man in the mask has remained a complete mystery. The brief moment when the mask is removed offers a fleeting glimpse of his face, but the quality is too poor for a positive identification. The identity of the second person, the woman who spanks him with the fly swatter, is even more mysterious, as her face is never seen. The presence of a second person suggested that this was not the work of a lone wolf, but a coordinated effort by at least two people. The content of the broadcast was a bizarre, stream of consciousness collage of pop culture references that seemed to be a series of inside jokes. The reference to WGN as the world's greatest newspaper was a direct jab at the station's corporate owner, the Tribune Company. The mocking of sports anchor Dan Roan, the humming of the Clutch Cargo theme song, the reference to the new Coke advertising campaign. It all felt like a piece of satirical performance art, a chaotic and absurdist commentary on media, consumer culture, and television itself. The choice of Max Headroom as the persona for the hijacking was also deeply significant. The original Max Headroom character was a fictional, AI-driven television host from a British TV movie called Max Headroom. 20 minutes into the future, the character lived in a dystopian, cyberpunk future where powerful television networks controlled society. He was a glitch in the system, a rogue AI who would interrupt broadcasts with his satirical and often nonsensical commentary. By adopting the persona of Max Headroom, the hijacker was making a powerful statement. They were, in effect, becoming a real-life version of the fictional character, a glitch in the corporate media machine, using the language of science fiction to critique the very medium they were hijacking. Over the years, the case has become a legend in hacker and tech culture, a celebrated act of electronic rebellion. The anonymity of the perpetrator has only enhanced their mythic status. They are seen not as criminals, but as folk heroes, digital pranksters who pulled off a brilliant and harmless stunt that exposed the vulnerability of the powerful television networks. However, the authorities have always taken the case far more seriously. The potential for a similar hijacking to be used for more malicious purposes, to broadcast a terrorist threat, a false emergency alert, or a piece of dangerous propaganda, was a very real and frightening possibility. The Max Headroom incident was a wake-up call for the broadcast industry, and it led to significant upgrades in the security of broadcast signals to prevent such an intrusion from happening again. In the years since the incident, numerous individuals have come forward, claiming to know who was behind the hijacking. In 2010, an anonymous user on the social media site Reddit posted a detailed account, claiming to have been part of the Chicago hacker scene at the time and identifying a specific individual as the mastermind. The story was detailed and compelling, but it was also completely unverifiable, and it could have been nothing more than a well-researched piece of fiction. Another theory suggests that the perpetrator was not a hacker at all, but a disgruntled former employee of one of the television stations. This would explain their intimate knowledge of the broadcast infrastructure. In this scenario, the hijacking was not a philosophical prank, but an act of personal revenge against a former employer. The case remains officially unsolved. The statute of limitations for the crime has long since expired, meaning that even if the perpetrators were to come forward and confess today, they could not be prosecuted. But no one has ever done so. The identities of the man in the mask and his fly swatter-wielding accomplice remain a complete secret. The Max Headroom incident is a unique and fascinating artifact from a very specific moment in technological history. It was a pre-internet crime that perfectly anticipated the culture of viral videos, memes, and digital disruption that would come to define the 21st century. It was an act that was simultaneously silly and brilliant, juvenile and technically sophisticated. It is a mystery that is both frustrating and, in a strange way, perfectly complete. The anonymity of the perpetrator is, in the end, the most important part of the story. By never being caught, the hijacker has allowed the act itself to become the entire message. They are not a person. They are a symbol. They are the ghost in the machine, a living embodiment of the glitch, a reminder that no matter how powerful or controlled our systems of communication become, there is always the potential for a phantom signal to break through, delivering a message that is as bizarre, as unsettling, and as completely unforgettable as the strange, laughing face of Max Headroom himself. The Max Headroom broadcast intrusion, while never officially solved by law enforcement, has been the subject of intense, ongoing investigation by a dedicated community of online sleuths, journalists, and technology enthusiasts. In the absence of an official conclusion, a powerful and highly detailed theory has emerged that many in the community believe has all but solved the case. This theory does not point to a disgruntled employee or a lone, enigmatic phantom, but to a specific group of individuals within the vibrant and chaotic hacker scene of 1980s Chicago. The central figure in this theory is a man named Eric Fournier, a musician and the creator of a bizarre, avant-garde public access television show called Chez St. John. Fournier was known to be a part of Chicago's underground arts and tech scene, a world where performance art, video technology, and a punk rock, anti-establishment ethos collided. The theory posits that the Max Headroom hijacking was not just a technical hack, but a piece of performance art, an extension of the same absurdist and disruptive spirit that Fournier would later pour into his own video projects. This theory gained significant traction in 2010, when an anonymous user on the website Reddit, claiming to have been a part of that same Chicago scene, posted a detailed narrative identifying Fournier and his brother as the two individuals in the video. The anonymous poster described the planning and execution of the event with a level of detail that seemed highly credible. According to this account, the hijacking was planned at a series of meetups of tech enthusiasts and artists. They had the technical know-how, access to the necessary microwave broadcast equipment through their connections at a local television station, and, most importantly, the artistic and philosophical motive to carry out such a stunt. The performance itself, according to this theory, was a largely improvised piece of absurdist theater. Eric Fournier is alleged to have been the man in the mask, his rambling, pop-culture-laden monologue a spontaneous creation of the moment. The corrugated metal background was not a random choice. It was meant to be a direct visual reference to the background used in the original Max Headroom television show, a detail that only a true fan would recognize. The entire event was designed to be a piece of guerrilla television, a brief, chaotic intrusion of anarchic art into the sanitized, corporate world of mainstream broadcast television. This theory is compelling because it provides a context and a motive that aligns perfectly with the known facts of the case. It explains the technical sophistication, the pop culture references, and the bizarre performance art nature of the broadcast. It frames the event not as a malicious crime, but as a calculated act of cultural rebellion. Tragically, Eric Fournier cannot confirm or deny his involvement. He passed away in 2010, just a few months before the detailed Reddit post brought his name to the forefront of the investigation. This has left the theory in a state of permanent, tantalizing ambiguity. Those who knew him have been divided. Some have said that the act was completely in line with his personality and his artistic sensibilities. Others have remained silent, perhaps out of loyalty or a desire not to speak ill of the dead. Without a direct confession from Fournier himself, or a corroborating statement from his alleged accomplices, the theory remains a powerful but unproven piece of internet-age detective work. The legacy of the Max Headroom incident is a significant one. In the immediate aftermath, it forced a complete overhaul of broadcast security. The FCC and television networks implemented new, more secure transmission technologies to prevent such a hostile takeover of the airwaves from ever happening again. The case became a benchmark in the history of telecommunications security. But its cultural legacy is even more profound. The event has been hailed as a pioneering act of hacktivism, a precursor to the digital disruption and culture jamming that would become a hallmark of the internet age. It was one of the first and most public examples of individuals using technology to talk back to the powerful media corporations that had, until then, controlled a one-way flow of information. The image of the distorted, laughing figure of Max Headroom taking over a television broadcast has become an iconic symbol of electronic rebellion, a piece of pre-internet folklore that has inspired countless other hackers, artists, and pranksters. The case also serves as a fascinating time capsule of the 1980s. The references to Clutch Cargo, New Coke, and WGN slogans root the event firmly in its time and place. It is a mystery that could only have happened in that specific era, a time when television was the dominant cultural force, and the technology to challenge it was just beginning to become accessible to a small, dedicated subculture of outsiders. Ultimately, the fact that the case remains officially unsolved is, in many ways, the perfect ending to the story. The anonymity of the perpetrators is essential to their legend. If they had been caught and prosecuted, they would have been reduced to mere criminals. But by vanishing without a trace, they have remained phantoms, their act a pure, unexplained piece of cultural myth. They are not individuals. They are the watcher of the airwaves, a collective entity known only by the mask they wore. The 90 seconds of chaotic, distorted video that they broadcast on that November night in 1987 has become one of the most studied, debated, and iconic pieces of found footage in history. It is a mystery that invites us to be detectives, to search for meaning in the noise and patterns in the static. Whether it was the work of Eric Fournier and his friends, a disgruntled television employee, or some other unknown group of electronic jesters, the result is the same. A perfect, anonymous crime that was also a brilliant, unforgettable piece of performance art. The signal has long since faded, but the ghost in the machine, the laughing, glitching face of Max Headroom, continues to haunt the static between the channels of our collective memory. The Unabomber, the case of the Golden State Killer, is a story about a man who hid behind a mask of suburban normalcy, a predator whose identity was finally revealed by a genetic ghost he left behind. But some phantoms leave behind a different kind of signature. They are not defined by their DNA, but by their ideas. This is a story about a different kind of serial killer, one who did not stalk his victims in person, but reached them through the mail. He was a ghost in the system, a meticulous craftsman of destruction who, for nearly 2 decades, waged a solitary, deadly war against what he saw as the evils of the modern world. This is the story of the long and frustrating hunt for the man who would become known as the Unabomber. The story begins not with a body, but with a simple, misplaced package. On May 25, 1978, a parcel was found in a parking lot at the University of Illinois at Chicago. It was addressed to a professor at Northwestern University, another major Chicago area school, but it had insufficient postage and was marked "Return to Sender." The return address was also from a Northwestern professor. Confused, the professor whose name was on the return address received the package but knew he hadn't sent it. Suspicious, he contacted campus security. When a security guard, Terry Marker, opened the package, the crude device inside exploded. The bomb was not powerful, and Marker suffered only minor injuries. The incident was strange but was initially treated as a local, isolated act of malice, perhaps the work of a disgruntled student. No one knew it was the opening shot in a 17-year reign of terror. A year later, in May of 1979, the bomber struck again. A graduate student at Northwestern University was injured when he opened another package bomb. The pattern was beginning to emerge. The targets were academic institutions. But it was the third bomb that would elevate the case from a local problem to a national security threat and give the killer his name. In November of 1979, a mailbag in the cargo hold of American Airlines Flight 444, traveling from Chicago to Washington, D.C., began to emit smoke. The pilots were forced to make an emergency landing. The device, a sophisticated bomb designed with a barometric pressure switch to detonate at a certain altitude, had failed to explode properly due to a faulty timer. Had it worked as designed, it would have brought down the passenger plane, killing everyone on board. The near catastrophe was a terrifying escalation. The bomber was no longer just targeting individuals. He was willing to cause mass casualties. The FBI was now in charge of the investigation. They had a new and terrifying kind of domestic terrorist on their hands. Because his early targets were a combination of universities and airlines, the FBI created a case file name for their unknown subject, Unabomb. For university and airline bomber, the name would stick. The Unabomb investigation became one of the longest, most expensive, and most frustrating in the history of the FBI. The bomber was a ghost. He left behind no fingerprints, no DNA, and no witnesses. His only signature was the bombs themselves, and they were, in their own way, works of art. The bombs were meticulously handcrafted, often from simple, untraceable materials like scrap wood, pieces of pipe, and common household screws. The bomber was a craftsman, a skilled woodworker and metalworker who seemed to take an immense, almost artisanal pride in his creations. Many of the components were handmade, including the triggers and the switches. He would often carve parts from wood or polish the metal casings, details that were completely unnecessary for the bomb's function but seemed to be a form of personal expression. He also began to incorporate a unique signature. The initials FC were found inscribed on several of the later bomb fragments. At the time, investigators had no idea what it stood for. The Unabomb Task Force was established, a dedicated team of agents who would spend years of their lives hunting this phantom. They began to build a profile of their unsub. He was clearly highly intelligent, methodical, and patient. His choice of targets, universities, computer science professors, airline executives, and eventually, a computer store owner, suggested a deep-seated grudge against technology and modern industrial society. He seemed to be a neo-Luddite, a person who believed that technology was destroying humanity and was waging a one-man war against the people and institutions he saw as responsible. The bombings continued sporadically throughout the early 1980s. A bomb injured the president of United Airlines, Percy Wood. Another severely injured a computer science professor at Vanderbilt University. The bomber was careful, often going years between attacks, making it impossible for investigators to predict his next move. He was a patient hunter. Then, on December 11, 1985, the Unabomber crossed a new and terrible line. He placed a bomb disguised as a piece of lumber in the parking lot behind a computer rental store in Sacramento, California. The store's owner, a 38-year-old man named Hugh Scruton, moved the object. It exploded, killing him instantly. The Unabomb case was no longer just about injuries and terror. It was now a murder investigation. The Phantom had proven he was willing and able to kill. The murder of Hugh Scruton marked a turning point. The FBI redoubled its efforts. They created a detailed profile of the killer, believing him to be a man with a background in academia, possibly a former professor or student who had a personal or professional failure that had sent him on this dark path. They believed he was a social isolate, a recluse who likely lived alone and worked in a small private workshop where he could build his devices without being detected. Despite the intensity of the investigation, the bomber remained a ghost. He struck again and again, injuring a computer store owner in Salt Lake City in 1987. And then, after another long period of silence, he returned with a vengeance in the 1990s. In 1993, he mailed a bomb that severely injured a computer science professor at Yale University. Another bomb maimed a geneticist at the University of California, San Francisco. His attacks were becoming more targeted, aimed at specific fields of scientific research that he seemed to despise. His final two bombs were fatal. In December 1994, an advertising executive named Thomas Mosser was killed by a package bomb sent to his home in New Jersey. And in April of 1995, a lobbyist for the timber industry named Gilbert Murray was killed by a bomb sent to his office in Sacramento. The Unabomber had now killed 3 people and injured more than 20 others over a span of 17 years. He was America's most elusive domestic terrorist. He was a man who had successfully waged a war against society from the shadows, a killer whose only known identity was a series of meticulously crafted, deadly packages and the initials FC. The FBI had spent millions of dollars and countless man-hours trying to find him, but they were no closer to discovering his identity than they had been in 1978. The case seemed to be at a complete and total dead end. But the Unabomber himself, in an act of supreme arrogance and intellectual pride, was about to give them the one clue they needed. He was tired of being a phantom. He wanted the world to understand not just what he had done, but why. He was about to send his final and most important message. A 35,000-word manifesto that would be both his ultimate act of terror and the key to his own undoing. After the fatal bombing in April of 1995 that killed Gilbert Murray, the Unabomber broke his long-held silence in a dramatic and unprecedented way. He began to communicate directly with his victims and with the media. He sent a letter to the New York Times, written from the perspective of a group calling themselves FC, the same initials found on his bombs. In the letter, the author claimed responsibility for the string of bombings and laid out a clear, ideological motive for his actions. He was not a madman, he argued, but a revolutionary. His goal was to fight against the destructive effects of modern technology and the industrial technical system that he believed was enslaving humanity. He then sent a copy of a massive 35,000-word essay to several publications, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. The essay, titled Industrial Society and Its Future, was a dense, academic, and deeply pessimistic philosophical treatise. It was a detailed and articulate critique of modern life, arguing that the Industrial Revolution had been a disaster for the human race, leading to psychological suffering, environmental destruction, and a loss of human autonomy. The author called for a worldwide revolution against the technological system, a return to a more primitive, wild state of nature. With the manifesto came a chilling ultimatum. The author demanded that the newspapers publish his entire essay, unabridged. If they complied, he promised he would desist from terrorism and stop his bombing campaign. But if they refused, he would send another bomb with the intent to kill. This ultimatum placed the U.S. government and the nation's most respected newspapers in an impossible ethical position. Should they give in to a terrorist's demands? Would publishing the manifesto be an act of responsible public safety, potentially saving lives, or would it be an act of capitulation, a dangerous precedent that would only encourage other terrorists? The FBI and the Attorney General's office debated the issue for weeks. They were deeply reluctant to give a platform to a murderer, but they also saw the manifesto as their single greatest opportunity to catch him. The document was a 35,000-word psychological profile. It was filled with the author's unique ideas, his specific turns of phrase, and his intellectual fingerprints. They believed that someone, somewhere, would read the manifesto and recognize the voice, the ideas, the distinct writing style of a brother, a son, a former student, or a reclusive acquaintance. It was a massive, nationwide gamble. In September of 1995, after intense consultation with the FBI, the Washington Post, in a joint decision with the New York Times, agreed to publish the manifesto. It was printed as a special supplement, a dense, text-heavy document that was distributed across the country. The FBI set up a special hotline and waited, hoping that their gamble would pay off, that a single phone call would finally give a name to the phantom they had been hunting for 17 years. The tip they were waiting for came from a man named David Kaczynski, a social worker living in Schenectady, New York. David had been following the Unabomber case with a growing sense of dread. The Unabomber's ideology, the anti-technology, pro-nature philosophy, sounded eerily familiar. It reminded him of his older brother, a man named Ted. Theodore Ted Kaczynski was a brilliant and deeply troubled recluse. He was a child prodigy, a mathematical genius who had enrolled at Harvard University at the age of just 16. He went on to earn a PhD in mathematics from the University of Michigan, and his doctoral dissertation was so complex and advanced that only a handful of mathematicians in the country could even understand it. He had been a rising star in the academic world, landing a coveted tenure-track position as a professor at the University of California, Berkeley. But Ted was also profoundly socially awkward, isolated, and filled with a deep-seated rage at the world. He hated the noise, the crowds, and the social pressures of modern life. After just 2 years of teaching at Berkeley, he abruptly resigned his position in 1969 and seemed to vanish. He had, in fact, decided to completely withdraw from the society he so despised. In the early 1970s, he bought a small plot of land in the remote, mountainous wilderness of western Montana, just outside the town of Lincoln. There, he built a tiny one-room cabin with his own hands. The cabin had no electricity and no running water. He lived a life of extreme, primitive self-sufficiency, hunting for his own food, reading voraciously, and living completely off the grid. He was the real-life embodiment of the Neo-Luddite philosophy he would later espouse in his manifesto. David Kaczynski had maintained a sporadic and difficult relationship with his estranged brother over the years. He knew of Ted's anti-technology beliefs and his deep-seated anger at the modern world. When the manifesto was published, David's wife, Linda, was the first to make the connection. She urged David to read it. As David read through the 35,000-word document, a horrifying suspicion began to crystallize into a near certainty. The writing style, the specific philosophical arguments, the unique turns of phrase, it was undeniably the voice of his brother, Ted. The realization was a devastating one. David was faced with an unimaginable moral dilemma. He had to consider the possibility that his own brother was a serial killer, the most wanted domestic terrorist in America. He struggled with the decision, but he knew what he had to do. He contacted a private investigator and then, through an attorney, he approached the FBI. He provided them with letters and other documents that Ted had written over the years. The FBI's linguistic and forensic analysts compared these documents to the manifesto. The match was perfect. The ideological themes, the writing style, and even specific idiosyncratic uses of punctuation were identical. The FBI now knew, with a high degree of confidence, the identity of the Unabomber. He was not a disgruntled airline mechanic or a failed academic. He was a Harvard-educated mathematical genius who had been living as a hermit in a tiny cabin in the Montana wilderness for over 25 years. The final phase of the longest manhunt in FBI history was about to begin. They had to plan a careful and covert operation to arrest a man who was known to be brilliant, paranoid, and an expert at building bombs. A team of FBI agents was dispatched to the remote mountains of Montana. They set up a surveillance operation, watching the small, isolated cabin from a distance. They had to be certain. They needed to get a DNA sample and more handwriting evidence without alerting him to their presence. They developed a ruse. They had a forest ranger approach the cabin under the guise of a land survey dispute. The ranger engaged Kaczynski in conversation, a tense and carefully scripted encounter designed to keep him occupied while other agents covertly entered his cabin to gather evidence. The operation was a success. They had what they needed. On April 3, 1996, a team of federal agents surrounded the small wooden cabin. They knocked on the door and arrested Theodore John Kaczynski, the brilliant recluse, the man who had waged a 17-year war against the modern world, surrendered without a fight. The hunt for the Unabomber was finally over. The Phantom had been caught, not by a lucky break or a forensic discovery, but by the power of his own words and the agonizing, courageous decision of his own brother. Of course, here is the third and final part of the story of the Unabomber. The Unabomber Part 3, the arrest of Theodore Kaczynski on April 3, 1996, was a stunning conclusion to one of the longest and most complex manhunts in FBI history. The public was captivated by the identity of the man behind the Unabomber moniker. He was not the simple, disgruntled mechanic that some had profiled, but a figure of profound and disturbing contradictions. A genius with a PhD from a top university who chose to live a life of primitive squalor. A man who preached about the sanctity of nature while using its materials to build weapons of terror. When FBI agents searched Kaczynski's tiny, 10 by 12-foot cabin in the Montana wilderness, they found a scene that was both a treasure trove of evidence and a chilling window into a brilliant but deeply disturbed mind. The cabin was a hoarder's den, crammed with books, tools, and supplies, but it was also a meticulously organized bomb-making factory. They found bomb-making components, detailed diagrams, and barrels of chemical precursors. They also discovered a live, fully assembled bomb, ready to be mailed, a terrifying confirmation that he had fully intended to continue his campaign of terror if his manifesto had not been published. The most important discovery, however, was Kaczynski's own written words. The cabin was filled with over 40,000 pages of journals, written in a dense, coded script. These journals were a detailed, day-by-day account of his life, his philosophy, and his crimes. He documented every single bombing with a cold, detached pride, referring to his victims not as people, but as specimens in his grand experiment. The journals were the ultimate confession, a complete and undeniable record of his 17-year war against society. They also revealed the true meaning of the FC initials found on his bombs. It stood for Freedom Club, the name of the fictional revolutionary group he had created in his own mind. The legal proceedings that followed were as complex and as controversial as the man himself. Kaczynski was charged with multiple federal offenses, including the murders of Thomas Mosser and Gilbert Murray. The evidence against him was overwhelming, but the trial became a battle not over his guilt, but over his sanity. His court-appointed defense team, led by renowned public defender Judy Clark, believed that their only viable strategy was to present an insanity defense. They argued that Kaczynski was a paranoid schizophrenic, a man whose actions were the product of a severe mental illness. They wanted to portray him as a tragic, deeply sick individual, not as a cold-blooded domestic terrorist. This strategy, they hoped, would save him from the death penalty. But Ted Kaczynski vehemently rejected this approach. He was a man of immense intellectual pride, and he was horrified by the idea of being labeled as mentally ill. He saw himself not as a madman, but as a revolutionary, a political philosopher whose actions were a logical and necessary response to a sick and destructive society. He believed that an insanity defense would completely invalidate his life's work and his message. He refused to be seen as just another crazy person. This created a profound conflict between Kaczynski and his own lawyers. He tried to fire them and represent himself. When the judge refused, he attempted to take his own life in his jail cell. The trial was thrown into chaos. Ultimately, to avoid being portrayed as mentally incompetent, Kaczynski made a fateful decision. Against the advice of his lawyers, he agreed to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for the prosecution taking the death penalty off the table. In May of 1998, Theodore Kaczynski was sentenced to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. He was sent to ADX Florence, the federal supermax prison in Colorado, where he would spend the rest of his life in near-total isolation, a fittingly solitary end for a man who had so completely rejected human society. The legacy of the Unabomber case is a complex and multifaceted one. On one level, it is a story about the triumph of a new kind of detective work. The case was solved not through traditional forensics, but through a combination of psychological profiling, linguistic analysis, and a courageous tip from a family member. The decision to publish the manifesto was a huge gamble, but it was a gamble that paid off, demonstrating the power of using a killer's own psychology against him. The case also had a significant impact on how the media and the public perceived terrorism. Kaczynski was not a typical terrorist motivated by religious or political group affiliations. He was a lone wolf, a new breed of offender driven by a deeply personal and idiosyncratic ideology. His case forced a reevaluation of the very definition of terrorism. The most enduring and unsettling part of the Unabomber's legacy, however, is his manifesto. Industrial Society and Its Future, while written by a murderer, is a surprisingly coherent and powerful critique of modern life. Many of the issues it raises, the alienating effects of technology, the destruction of the environment, the loss of human autonomy in a complex, bureaucratic world, are issues that continue to resonate deeply in our society. This has created a strange and uncomfortable phenomenon. Kaczynski, the murderer, is rightly condemned, but Kaczynski, the philosopher, has found a small but persistent following in certain anti-technology and anarchist circles. His ideas, divorced from his violent actions, continue to be debated and discussed, a fact that would have likely given the man himself a great deal of satisfaction. For the Kaczynski family, the story is one of unimaginable tragedy. David Kaczynski's decision to turn in his own brother was an act of immense moral courage. He did it to prevent further loss of life, but it was an act that came at a great personal cost, severing his final connection to the brother he had once loved. He used the reward money he received from the FBI to create a fund for the victims of his brother's crimes. A small act of restitution for a lifetime of damage. Ted Kaczynski died in his prison cell in June of 2023, at the age of 81. He remained unrepentant to the end, a man convinced of the righteousness of his own violent crusade. His story is a chilling reminder of the dark path that can be forged by a brilliant mind when it is consumed by isolation, rage, and a fanatical ideology. He was a man who tried to bomb the world back to a state of nature, a modern hermit who became a modern monster, a phantom who, for 17 long years, proved that the most dangerous threats can come from the most unexpected and isolated of places.